All right, welcome. Thank you all for coming out today. I'm Frank Gavin, the director of the Visitor Center. We're in for a real treat today. For those of us who, like everybody in this room, who care about international relations and international security, one of the great challenges is making sense of all the technological changes and what impact they have. In particular, you'll hear things about cyber or automated weapons, and the thing that you'll hear about most often today is the effects of artificial intelligence on international and national security. And for people that don't have a great technical background on these questions, it can be very intimidating and very difficult to figure out exactly how to make sense of the various claims that are made, particularly coming out of Silicon Valley and other places. So this is an extraordinarily important issue, and I can think of few better people to help us understand this, explain this, and frame this than our guest, Michael Horowitz. Professor Horowitz is a professor and the deputy director of the Perry World House at the University of Pennsylvania. I first got to know Mike about a decade ago when I read his excellent first book, which is all about the diffusion of military technology. I see a few people in Professor Brand's class and mine, so you're familiar with this book because we assigned it. In fact, we owe Professor Horowitz a debt of gratitude because much of that week's reading were based on us going to Mike and saying, we don't know what the hell to teach on this, help us think about this. And Mike was extraordinarily generous and insightful. So we're really in for a treat. This first book, The Diffusion of Military Power, which won a whole variety of awards and of course helps us understand that it's not just the technology itself, but how it's integrated and adapted by various organizations and governing systems. He wrote another book a couple years ago, Why Leaders Fight, which is a pathbreaking work looking at the backgrounds of particular leaders and their inclinations to use force or not use force based on their backgrounds. Mike has a wide range of interests and intellectual pursuits. It's actually pretty intimidating. Everything about drones I've learned from Mike. He's done stuff on nuclear, he's done stuff on any number of topics, and he's moving quite bravely into this very, very important topic of artificial intelligence and how we should think about it. The title of his talk today is Artificial Intelligence, International Competition and the Balance of Power. Please join me in welcoming Mike Horowitz to SciStar.
So nice of you. Nice that you mentioned my first book, since in some ways what I'm doing today is going back to some of the initial research that I did on how military power diffuses to try to forecast in some ways what we should expect in a world of artificial intelligence. And it's hard when talking about artificial intelligence not to start with the way that the world tends to see this, which is, I think, a very simple equation. So take a robot, add a brain, and add a gun. What do we get? Whether it's the Matrix, the Terminator, Battlestar Galactica, Ex Machina, varieties of different like television and movies, we get the sort of destruction of the world. And now obviously this says, I think, in some ways a lot more about how we see ourselves. Like we imagine the first thing that like a smart non-human would do is try to destroy us. But I think it's interesting to sort of keep this in the back of your mind because it's certainly what influences the way that a lot of public and even elites think about the importance of artificial intelligence. And so what I'm going to do today is lay out a little bit of what I work on in general as a scholar, then talk about sort of what is artificial intelligence, go in some ways to some of the theoretical ideas from my first book, laying out how technology influences the balance of power in international conflict, and then apply that to artificial intelligence, concluding with what I will sort of lay out two different pathways for how it could shape international competition, and especially this ongoing, what seems like now, an ongoing arms race, according to many, between the United States and China. So, who am I? All right, four big things that I basically work on. The first is what I'm going to talk about today, which is research on military innovation, emerging technologies, and global politics. Second piece of work that I do is on forecasting. Coming out of work that I did on the Good Judgment Project, sort of crowdsourced and algorithmic-based forecasts. I have some forthcoming articles on that topic as well. The third topic is the one that Professor Gavin mentioned, leaders. Looking at the background experiences of leaders and how it shapes their behavior once they get into office, especially their military behavior. And the final area that I've been working on, and I just really like this picture a lot, is actually about religious militant groups and alliances between them and how it influences their trajectory. So, 4 things that are united in that they're all about, stuff around the world that I think is really important, but not necessarily, specifically, connected to each other. And then within that broader area of military innovation, there are further sort of 4 sub-areas that I work in. So the first, which I'm going to talk about today, is about the artificial intelligence, military applications of it, and the implications, potentially, for the balance of power in international competition. The second looks at crisis bargaining. And if you think about artificial intelligence and what former Deputy Secretary Bob Work said is fighting at machine speed, that has lots of implications in some ways for crises like potentially the Cuban Missile Crisis. Because if you think that you could lose faster, what does that mean? It means that you might think about how to deploy your forces in different ways, how to avoid getting decapitated in a conflict. So this is work on AI, autonomous weapons, and crisis stability. Third area is very different methodologically. Uses survey experiments to tease out the way the public and elites think about the adoption of emerging technologies, specifically artificial intelligence and autonomous weapons in situations that range from robotic surgery to autonomous cars to the military realm. And pictured here, we have the mascot of the campaign to stop killer robots, whose activism on this issue inspired this part of my research. And then the last is work that I've been doing on the proliferation of drones. I've published a couple of papers looking at both trying to statistically model how it is that drones are military-grade drones are spreading throughout the international system, as well as the implications for international politics. I've published a lot on this topic. This is my Bitmoji, in case anybody is curious. Also, I taught Professor Gavin how to make one a couple years ago. All right.
Professor Brand.
So, what is artificial intelligence? Think about this in like a very common sense way for the purposes of this presentation, and there's a paper that goes with this, but that's super boring. In that, the use of computers to sort of simulate human behavior that requires intelligence. Now, one of the important things to keep in mind here at the outset is the way that what we call artificial intelligence is often a moving target. And that as soon as machines and computers can do something, we say that that's dumb. Like we used to say that, oh, if a computer could ever beat a human at chess, then that would truly mean artificial intelligence. And then of course in 1997, that happens and we're like, oh, like whatever, like chess is a solvable game. And then you have, a year and a half ago, AlphaGo, which, of course, got, I think, triggered a lot of the current public debate about the AI and the future. And, it's like, all right, well, chess, that was easily solvable, but all of the different permutations of moves possible in Go, no computer could ever do that. You'd have to be actually smart to do that. Then a computer does it, and then AlphaGo 0 trains itself to do it, and then we're like, oh, that's not really AI. So, keeping in mind that this is always a moving target, I think you can imagine the sort of 2 biggest branches of thinking about methods of artificial intelligence. You have the sort of 60s-derived sort of Simon symbolic language approach versus the more connectionist approach, which is what we see and talk about often today, the sort of computational approaches to artificial intelligence. And you can imagine popular terms you've probably heard of, like machine learning and neural networks, are examples of computationally based artificial intelligence. And today, when I talk about the impact of AI for the balance of power and for international competition, I'm going to be talking about narrow applications of artificial intelligence. So think like an AlphaGo 0 on steroids, but imagine a continuum where on the one end you have, say, an AI built to do one thing, whether it's like play Tetris or fire a weapon in a particular way, or do some other game. And on the far end, you have the super intelligent AI that decides to destroy, all of humanity. So we're sort of at the we're at one end, as opposed to say like a Nick Bostrom or somebody who's written very prominently about the risks to humanity from superintelligence. And in the middle, you can imagine something like AGI, artificial general intelligence, or the idea of a AI that could basically walk and chew gum at the same time, even if it wasn't human capable smart. So we're focused here more on the narrow sort of end, which is also the end where most researchers have more confidence about what developments would look like. There was a great survey of AI researchers that came out last year that suggested huge confidence intervals in how they think about when you could get to artificial general intelligence, when AIs could replace humans at various sorts of tasks. There's still a lot of uncertainty in the research community, and so thus, we need to be modest in the way we think about the implications for international politics as well. And I think it's important to keep in mind when we talk about artificial intelligence that it's an enabler, not a weapon. And by that I mean, think about what AI can do. It could direct physical objects, can process data, overall information management. There's obviously a relationship between what one might call AI and the cyber dimension as well. But what is AI not? AI is not a gun. AI is not a plane. AI is not a nuclear weapon. It's bigger and broader than that. I think the best analogies when thinking about artificial intelligence are something more like the combustion engine or electricity. And that what we're talking about is a technology that will enable lots of different things that will shape society, shape militaries, etc., rather than a discrete box that sort of does just one thing in a particular, like in the military realm, say like a machine gun or something like that. So AI is much broader, and I think it's important to keep that in mind. So that's what AI is, and I keep in mind this notion of AI as an enabler. So now I want to talk about theoretically what this could mean for the balance of power. What are the key questions that we want to know? If we take that definitional notion of AI and we want to understand how it will shape international politics, then we need to understand how technologies shape international politics in general. Because I think another problem when we see discussions in popular media, and sometimes even in this town, about AI, is that we tend to assume like technological change has never happened before. Like this is the first time there's ever been some big new technology that people don't really understand. Of course that's not really true. And I think it's critical at this point to delineate between invention and innovation. And this gets to some of my prior work on adoption capacity, which was focused very much on complete innovations. So you can think about an invention as creating a new technology. So say to go to something very popular for people that study military innovation, the World War I and World War II, the British invent the tank in World War I. But it's not really clear exactly what the tank is for, how you would use it. It takes 2 decades of experimentation by the Germans to figure out how to turn the tank into the military innovation that we call blitzkrieg. And the other technologies, of course, go along with that as well. This is important here because of the stage we're at in thinking about artificial intelligence, and that we're in some ways before this. Which is one reason why it's kind of to some extent doing this work is necessarily a little more speculative. But it also means we need to adapt our existing theoretical tools, because most of the research that's been done on technological change and in competition or the balance of power, other topics, that got brighter, tends to be here, if not here. All right. So I mentioned that adoption capacity word before. What my prior research suggests is that there are really 3 questions that we need to answer if we want to understand how any new technology, in some ways, would shape international politics. First is the character of the technologies themselves, and how they will shape warfare. What do they allow you to do, basically, that you couldn't do before? Second is how are organizations going to use them? This is another fallacy, I think, that often comes up in in debates that we see about artificial intelligence at present. That there's an assumption that the technology itself is some sort of magic that will change the world. If you look at the impact of technologies in world history, from the printing press to nuclear weapons, what we see is that the impact of technology is mediated by institutions. It's the choices organizations make about how to use technologies that influence how they actually matter. Moreover, there are some organizations that are better poised to exploit emerging technologies than others. And that, for example, the more disruptive a technology is to the critical task of an organization, to how it's been doing business, and to high status individuals in that organization, the harder it can be to adopt a new technology. So the third question is, how will these technologies spread? And to understand that, we need to understand things like, what's the unit cost of the technology? Is it based in software or hardware? And are the technological advances undergirding the technology coming more from the commercial sector or the military sector? Of course, as unit costs go down, as things are more software oriented, as they're based more in commercial technology, often they spread much faster. Whereas, say, like stealth is the prototypical case of something that it's easy to shield. It's exclusively military, it's really expensive, and it's really complicated. Thus, you can sort of prevent its diffusion. Spoiler alert for later, AI is not stealth. So, how do technologies spread then? So this is an S-curve. And where on the left here, on the vertical axis, we have the total number of adopters of a technology. And on the bottom, we have the time since a first mover demonstrated. And people have used this kind of model to understand everything from like microwaves, fancy yogurt, like iPhones, to sort of Netflix. So you can think about inventions, like the iPhone gets invented. And then you could think about the takeoff point, when everybody, when like only the cool kids basically have iPhones. And then you can think about the slowdown point is the point where like everybody's grandparents have an iPhone and like that's the only one that they can use because it's the simple one. I'm an Android user. But this we can use to try to understand how technology spread in general. This is basically where we are, if not before, in thinking about potential implementations of AI, both in the economy and in society. And so then we want to understand, what kind of technology are we talking about? Remembering that AI is an enabler and not a weapon. So I'm going to cheat now. Let's compare how we think about something like artificial intelligence. Let me lay out 3 weapons to keep in the back of your mind as we continue on. So you think about a continuum where you have some things that spread really slowly and some things that spread really quickly. So nuclear weapons, good example of something that has spread really slowly. Like North Korea proved that you can put your nickels in a jar like every day for 40 years and eventually like get a nuclear weapon. But it's actually really difficult. It's expensive. There are significant resource constraints. The international community really tries to stop you, etc. This is a 4th generation fighter aircraft. It's a good example of something that was reasonably difficult to acquire when it was invented, but that most countries over time have been able to figure out if they needed them, essentially, mostly by buying them from the US or another country. This is available, this is an AK-47, available like in any city, anywhere, basically, in the world. And so what I want you to be thinking about as I keep going, because I'm going to come back to this, is what kind of technology is AI? And then what does that mean for what its diffusion will actually look like? All right, so I've talked about what AI is, laid out some theory for how I think about this issue and the kinds of questions that we want to ask. And now we want to apply these questions to thinking about AI and the balance of power. And let's start with everybody's favorite, Vladimir Putin. He's been very clear about what he thinks the impact of AI will be, and that he has argued that, I mean, it's like a little hyperbole maybe, but I mean, look, it's Putin, that AI is the future, not only for Russia, but all humankind. Being the leader will become the ruler of the world. Something interesting here. There's an assumption here. Whoever becomes the leader in this sphere will become the ruler of the world. That it's not about who has the best AI technology at the end of the day. It's about getting ahead first, which means there's an assumption about first mover advantage, which we can import from econ essentially to try to understand when different sorts of technologies sort of shape the balance of power in international competition. And what Putin is asserting is that AI is the kind of technology that could have significant first mover advantages, and that thus you need to be out there. You need to be out there ahead. Rest in peace, Stephen Hawking. But he and Elon Musk, who are obviously people much smarter than I am, are really worried about this. They think Putin's absolutely right. They've argued that AI technology is revolutionary, and Musk has argued it could risk World War III. But I mean, those are like fortune cookie kind of arguments. They're sort of short form, not very detailed. And what can we figure out if we go deeper and more systematically into trying to assess this using some of the tools and questions that I laid out before? So to start, we know that there's ongoing competition in AI. I mean, pretty much, every time you pick up, actually, it's probably only because that's when I pick up the newspaper. But the Wall Street Journal, The Economist, the New York Times, all in the last 4 months have run specials or features about competition in artificial intelligence, asserting that there's bilateral competition between the United States and China. So the first thing, remember I told you a couple slides ago, Putin's argument that there'll be large first mover advantages from AI. A second assumption that people are making is that competition in AI will be bilateral, that the US and China, for reasons that have to do with investments, educational systems, and interests, are going to be ahead. This means Putin's kind of screwed, but that's a different story. All right, so what I want to do now is start to answer those 3 questions that I laid out in the previous section. So remember those 3 questions. How does an emerging technology shape the character of war? How do organizations adopt technologies, and how will technology spread? So, what would militaries actually use AI for? Again, it's early days in understanding the technology, but there are 3 applications that I want to highlight as illustrative. The first is demonstrated by something that's ongoing already, Project Maven in the US military. That is about image recognition and data processing. The idea that instead of having a bunch of US military personnel basically staring for hours until their eyes bleed, get footage from drones, instead you could have AI systems do that, which could free up those people to do more meaningful, substantive tasks. Let's put aside the question of adversarial hacking and adversarial imagery. There's Clune et al. Other work on how that can be a problem. Presume that that's sort of something that you could address. So that's one potential implementation of AI, and it's consistent in some ways with how the U.S. Department of Defense has thought about the use of uninhabited systems, sort of dull, dirty, dangerous tasks. Image processing, dull. Second is what's pictured here. Everybody's favorite, swarms. The idea that that military since World War II have been characterized by a trend towards smaller numbers of high-quality aircraft carriers, tanks, etc. Now, in a world of A2AD, there's been concern that this model is no longer sustainable. And AI is something that could potentially fuel a shift back towards mass in force structure, in that if you have a small number of stealthy aircraft, and what you're worried about is that any one of them being shot down is dangerous in terms of your ability to complete a mission. And if many are shot down, it could influence your ability to complete future missions. One way to handle that is by either only having a larger number of smaller systems, which are a lot more replaceable. But then the question is, how do those operate? Because if they need to be operated by a human controller, then that means you need a bandwidth. It means you need data links, and it means you need a person or a couple of people capable of doing that. But in the case of a large-scale conventional conflict in the future, there are reasons to think that might not be true. You might have adversaries that want to deny your ability to access satellites, that might want to reduce your bandwidth, that might want to hack into sorts of systems. And so having the ability to have these systems be able to autonomously control and execute some kind of strike package or mission plan could be really attractive, which is why there's lots of work on swarming technology going on as well. One limitation though, think about how like small this actually sort of is. And now imagine the big breakthrough in battery technology that you need, and in miniaturization of munitions to make those things meaningful. Third application that I want to talk about is something even bigger, and that's battle management, where the notion is you have human forces on the battlefield and machine forces on the battlefield, and you want to make decisions at machine speed. What an AI battle management system can do is help tell you where to put your forces, when to put them there, and help your uninhabited forces avoid potential obstacles like, say, enemy radars or other kinds of issues. And so, we've moved from, data processing is one application, swarms are a second one, sort of more at the battlefield, and then up higher, more to the operational level of war and thinking about battle management of a particular conflict. And these are all ways that applications of artificial intelligence could potentially shape the character of warfare. So what is an organization to do then with all of these possibilities? Or put another way, what are the organizational politics of artificial intelligence actually going to look like? Again, it's uncertain. Still in early days in thinking about the technology. But we can derive from theory some potential ideas. We know that military technologies are most disruptive for the militaries trying to adopt them. When they affect things like doctrine, training, recruiting, promotion, there's lots of research on that. And we've got these sort of three examples that I gave you before. Image processing is what one might call sustaining from a technology perspective. Who's being displaced by it? Not people with the highest status jobs in the military, and you're essentially freeing them up to do higher status tasks. So you could think about something like image processing from an AI perspective is low-hanging fruit for bureaucratic politics. Swarms, potentially very different in that some of the highest status, most bureaucratically embedded interest groups in the military are those involving fighter pilots and bomber pilots. The notion that the appropriate way to project power in the air might no longer be something like large inhabited aircraft would be incredibly disruptive for militaries that have spent billions of dollars and are still spending billions of dollars on developing lots of sort of new inhabited aircraft. The third sort of battle networks, I want to use an example to talk about why I think it could be especially disruptive. So in the late 19th century, naval warfare moves from like Pirates of the Caribbean style, where you have like two ships just like lined up, like firing away at each other, to over like a couple of miles, as modern steel battleships with larger guns can fire at each other. If you're moving from like Pirates of the Caribbean style to like a mile or two away, all of a sudden you need much better technology to be able to operate those guns effectively. What you need in some ways is calculus. If you need calculus to operate the guns, now you need the head gunner to be somebody that understands calculus. And so the growth in distance in naval warfare essentially drives a shift in recruiting, in training, and in promotion in navies in the late 19th century, as you have to basically get a new class of engineers specifically trained to sort of their ship's moving, you're trying to hit a ship that's moving that's far away. One could imagine something similar when it comes to thinking about how to operate and deploy more advanced narrow AI systems. And by that I mean one of the biggest challenges of these kinds of technologies is that they're brittle. They operate in the environment that they're designed to operate in and have trouble operating further. Which means you need to know how the technology works in some ways to know what environments are appropriate to deploy them in and what are not appropriate to deploy them in, which means that future commanders at the operational level could in theory need to understand how algorithms work, which is not something that we require, either in the US or in other countries. It's senior military commanders today. So, how then can we figure out which militaries might be best poised to exploit this? Some of my previous work suggests there are sort of three things that help predict whether, this was designed to predict whether a country would be successful at adopting a military innovation, I think it's actually helpful for understanding the likelihood of creating an innovation as well. First is R&D experimentation, which is just a good proxy for how much are you investing in the future. And in AI, China is clearly number one. Second is organizational age. In that, as organizations, as militaries age and become more bureaucratically established, especially if they have not experienced major battlefield defeat, it can lead to what Mansur Olson calls bureaucratic sclerosis. It can make it hard to innovate because everybody is set in their ways and doing things the way that they've always been done. Third is critical task focus. The idea that how a military is just like a business or another, or like an NGO or heck, a university, describes their critical task can be important. And that the broader you say your task is, the more things can fit under that, so the more new things you can do without it feeling organizationally disruptive and disrupting your organizational culture. So they think about this as the difference between the Marines and the motto of sort of every Marine a rifleman, and the Army, where the motto often is maximum firepower on target. So what does that mean? It means that we would imagine the Marines in some ways as having a broader critical task focus and being better able to consider different kinds of capabilities that might not be so disruptive. And I'll come back to this, but sort of who's best positioned then organizational. Third thing that I wanted to remember, the third question is how are these technologies going to spread? And so now I want to go through some of those metrics from adoption capacity theory that I laid out before. The first is thinking about the unit cost and whether we think about AI as hardware or software. This is potentially critical. The challenge is that AI in some ways is clearly both. In that, here's why it's software. Imagine a MQ-9 Reaper drone, which remotely piloted. There's no AI at all. Now imagine an AI-powered MQ-9 Reaper. It would look the same. Note the challenge this creates for arms control, by the way, in that arms control generally works because you can count things. If a remotely piloted system and an autonomous system look exactly the same, then you can't count things, which actually can make arms control a lot harder. So in that way, AI in some ways is clearly software. It's like something you would plug into a Reaper to make it operate. But AI in many ways is clearly hardware, in that despite decreases in the cost of computing, the amount of computing power that you need, the crunching that you need to generate the sorts of algorithms that OpenAI or DeepMind or others create, it's incredibly intensive. And it's created a barrier to entry in and of itself. In that we used to, I think about AI as almost exclusively software, like it's just a program. And in some ways, once the algorithm's done crunching, it is software in a way. But the creation of new algorithms, and especially new algorithms that might have more exclusively military tasks, is in some ways hardware. All right. Second question is, so there's that unit cost question, and about whether it's hardware or software. There's also the question of whether innovation is driven more by commercial companies or by militaries. So here, I'm fusing AI and robotics together. We've got, if you have what you would call like a robot in your house, it's probably a Roomba. This is Baxter, who has super creepy eyes, who's a manufacturing robot. This is actually like an algorithm that can build you a hamburger. And Toyota built a Android that could play the violin just to prove it could. But none of these things are funded by the Department of Defense in the United States or by militaries in any country. If you Google something like drone swarm or autonomous system swarm, what's most likely to come up are university researchers, like from the Grasp Lab at Penn or elsewhere, doing this work, which would imply in some ways that a lot of the impetus for the underlying technology is commercial. And commercially oriented technology spreads faster because it means that, say, unlike fighter aircraft, where maybe like a Lockheed can build you an aircraft that nobody else in the world could build, there are lots of companies around the world in advanced information economies who could claim technological leadership in Singapore, in South Korea, in China, in Israel, which in some ways can democratize the technology, because if the market forces are involved in encouraging you to develop it, then it means other countries can kind of catch up. So then what I want to lay out are two pathways for thinking about this and then the terminal impact on the balance of power. The first flows from what I just told you, because what I just told you implies that key AI capabilities are fundamentally dual use, that there are commercial needs for them. And image recognition is a classic example of this. Militaries are interested in it, so is Google, so is Facebook. So you have commercial incentives for technological invention. I think what this means is that picture I showed you before about bilateral US-Chinese competition is probably wrong, in that the more dual use a technology is, the more it means other companies from around the world could potentially be able to compete, which is why you're seeing massive increases in AI investments in places like Israel, like Singapore, like South Korea. I actually think what it means then is that competition for dual use AI could look a lot more like late 19th century competition in industries like steel and chemicals that were being created as part of the second industrial revolution. So obviously then that implies more rapid diffusion of the technology, but it also means that the first mover advantages could be relatively limited, because anything you invent that's dual use is going to be relatively easier, not easy. There may be really complicated commercial technology, companies can get advantages, but relatively easier for others to catch up, which means the relative impact on the balance of power could be actually pretty limited potentially, assuming all countries act rationally. It's an assumption. It also means that fast followers could potentially catch up. If you're not first, you could mimic. But there's another scenario here too, and that's that one of the examples I gave you, that notion of battle management, is not something with a clear commercial analog. It's something where it's an almost exclusively military capability, and thus where the actors interested in working on it would probably be those interested in militaries. It's possible that commercial spillovers could be relevant for developing those kinds of algorithms, but we don't know. And in this kind of case, with more exclusively military applications of AI, if the algorithms are sufficiently different, and also keep in mind the need for greater encryption and cybersecurity on military applications of any sort of commercial algorithms, sort of whether neural nets, machine learning algorithms, or what have you. It means that this is the case in which I think you could have more bilateral competition, where what you need are a massive investment of resources in military-specific developments of AI. And so this could be a case in some ways where everybody can't necessarily play. So you're likely to have less rapid diffusion, and your first mover advantages then would be much larger. There's a bigger edge potentially from getting there, first. Like think about stealth in the United States. Well, again, stealth is like a far extreme example of this. It's unlikely that you'd see something like that. So what will this then mean at the very end of the day for the balance of power? As I mentioned before, this idea of what things would mean if countries acted totally rationally the way we would expect, but they don't always do that. In part because their incentives aren't always aligned. Pictured here is the X-47B, which was an aircraft, uninhabited aircraft invented by Northrop for the US military that by algorithm could take off from and land on an aircraft carrier. Unbelievable breakthrough. This is in mothballs right now because the program that it was originally created for is now going to be an air-to-air refueler called the MQ-25 Stingray, designed to extend the range of the F-35. So essentially, what's the US doing? It's taking some of these technologies and trying to use them to make the US better at what it's already doing. That being warfare with inhabited aircraft. China's pushing on these sorts of capabilities too, but seems less convinced that the future is necessarily in things like refuelers, and seems more willing to invest in systems that could be potential replacements. And so one of the interesting things to see and track will be the extent to which, not will the US invent the widgets, because the US will always invent the widgets. The American economy has been a force for that for decades. But will the American military implement the widgets? And I think what you have at the end of the day is a glass half full, glass half empty story. Where on the one hand, no country has ever been more aware of the risks that I just laid out than the American military today. The third offset strategy in the last administration, which is more or less being continued under another name, led by Deputy Secretary Work and Secretary Carter, was designed in some ways to hedge against some of these risks. The U.S. is more aware than ever before. But that awareness is not necessarily translating into procurement, into the development and deployment of specific systems. And the risk of the United States is that this technology matures faster than other people think, and that others then could potentially be able to charge ahead. But again, it's hard to say. Based on what I told you before, we're still in very early days in thinking about these capabilities. So I think history suggests, and hopefully the example I just gave you suggests, that organizational politics are something we really need to understand when we're thinking about the impact of AI. It's not just going to be about the technology. It's going to be about how countries, and we could have just as easily done this about the economy, how companies think about using artificial intelligence. And that the adoption challenges of artificial intelligence will vary depending on how disruptive they are to how organizations operate today. Image recognition, not so disruptive. Battle management, maybe something different. And then we have these two pathways. And the truth is, we'll have some types of AI that follow both of them. The question is, which ones will be more important, and then how will that shape international politics? Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Excellent presentation. So much to chew on. I'll take the lead here and ask a question. How much of this? I was thinking about your battleship example and how that took place during an arms race, and I always think about both on the innovation side, but particularly on the organizational side, how much these dynamics and pressures shift once a battle or war begins, right? And it seems particularly with this technology where you have a lot of the reveal and conceal dilemmas, where you just don't know in many ways until it happens, but that might be wrong. And I was wondering, and also these technologies will obviously probably change the shape and duration of any sort of conflict. How should we think about everything you so nicely laid out, both sort of peacetime versus in the heat of battle?
It's an interesting question. Like, one thing that I think a lot of people are worried about, I mean, there's a big report that I think there were like 30 authors on that came out in February about malicious uses of AI and safety issues kind of surrounding AI. That's been a big focus, I think, of the AI research community as they've started to engage in the national security space. Because what they're worried about is that like, it's all well and good when people say, oh, we're going to test everything and like make sure it'll work and like that'll be great. But what the concern is that essentially in the heat of a conflict, that you'll have systems, AI systems deployed that haven't been properly vetted, which risk sort of catastrophic accidents. Now, I will say that I think that that's too simplistic an understanding of how militaries make decisions about deployment, and that nobody wants their systems to work better, like, you know, more reliably than sort of militaries do. And you need to think that there was an awful lot of upside essentially in some technology before you'd be willing to accept some like risk, you know, deploying it in a battle or something where you've never seen it before. I mean, I do think that you're likely to see accelerated development as you get closer, you know, if say, suppose a world in which security competition between the United States and China intensifies, I think you would certainly see a lot more competitive development of algorithms in that case, and probably a lot more testing as well. But I think it's hard to. Whereas in peacetime, you know, you'll be more likely to move slower. But the thing that we don't know yet is, I mean, and this is so there's often an explainability problem with algorithms. in that so say like the AlphaGo example, where there's one move during the second game where AlphaGo I played Go like once in my life. Never is not true, but whatever. I barely understand the example I'm about to give. But basically like the algorithm made a move that like so flummoxed the sort of human player that the human player like leaves the room for 15 minutes to get something, calm down a little bit. But that's actually a big problem on the battlefield. If you imagine what the future battlefield looks like as sort of humans and machines, with some things controlled by algorithms, but with sort of human supervision in many cases, some of those issues I think are going to need to be worked through before you actually end up seeing widespread deployment. But there'd be nothing like crises to encourage people to do that.
Open it up, general comments, questions?
I do.
Jump in, Professor Grant.
Sure. So on the issue of first mover advantages, presumably there are at least two dimensions to figuring out what degree of first mover advantage is, right? So one is how long it takes and how costly it is for somebody else to catch up, to mimic your innovation. But the other would just be what degree of asymmetric advantage you get from having it when somebody else doesn't, right?
Yeah.
So you can imagine technology that it only takes 4 years before you catch up, but you get massive advantage.
Yeah, absolutely.
So on that second dimension, where do you put some of the applications of AI?
I mean, the honest answer is I don't know. I'll give you my best guess based on sort of how I think about it right now. I think that we would imagine that especially, I think incremental advantages, to the extent that you think about literature on military effectiveness and OODA loops and those sorts of things, incremental advantages that let you operate at faster speeds should be actually pretty helpful on the battlefield. And so it's easy to imagine some situations where first mover advantages, even if short, could be very meaningful. But I mean, it also gets to the question of what one imagines future battlefields sort of looking like. But if you imagine battlefields that look kind of like today's, but faster, then I would say incremental improvements in things like battle management, say, could actually make a pretty big difference. Even though someone could maybe catch up reasonably quickly. That's a guess though, I think, more than anything else. I mean, I think I've seen AI researchers making both of those, not using the language that we would use, but making both of these kinds of arguments. And it's one of the challenges in some ways about this space is that, I see somebody like Elon Musk kind of making arguments about like AI in World War III, and I'm like, dude, you need to read Tom Schelling. And whereas, you talk to a bunch of sort of colonels or something about it, and, and you're just in a whole different, world, but one I presume will be addressed over time. That's my best guess.
Yes, George Chen, first year ME student. And I'm curious because in the previous slide, you mentioned that AI would go into dual use and the military exclusive use, and that the military exclusive use would benefit from first mover advantage. But I also wonder, wouldn't the commercial-oriented dual use AI just goes and develops so fast that eventually makes any investment today in the military AI to be obsolete very soon before it comes to fruition?
It's a good question. I mean, I think that you're absolutely right in the broadest sense, in that if we imagine AI as AI leadership is one of several critical things that will undergird economies in the middle of the 21st century, then, we know that over time, you can't sustain military power leadership without economic leadership. I mean, that's more or less, I think, an iron law in politics. The Ottomans, Austro-Hungarian Empire, lots of people demonstrate that. Then clearly having commercial leadership will be essential to military applications. When I talk about here, these sort of like military exclusive AI, what essentially I'm talking about are potential applications where there are not necessarily commercial analogs to them, and so private sector companies aren't necessarily working on it, and where the problems essentially or problem sets are different enough that you can't port over
transferable.
So right, essentially where it's not transferable. Because something like image recognition, like say Project Maven in the US has like a big breakthrough, and the US gets like way ahead in military applications of image recognition. There are lots of companies working on image recognition in AI, and it's not necessarily going to be that, given what we know that they're working on in the public sphere, it's easy to imagine those sort of porting over to the military realm. I think that's different for potential applications where it'd be harder to port something over, because the types of decisions you're talking about are different.
Either one.
Me?
Either.
I had a question about the battle management. We were on a trip to Israel and we went to this company called Mobileye, which is working on self-driving cars and AI. And the discussion was about, how they would make sure that there would not be any errors in the software and the algorithms which are implemented. And they said that they constantly keep updating the maps and also the algorithms which work with them. I'm wondering, this is some AI is obviously, the more you use it, the more it works. The algorithms actually work better. How will that work in data management where you don't really have a set idea about how things will work?
Sure. No, that's a really great question. Like imagine, for any of you that have, read your Clausewitz, like think about fog and friction and what that means for AIs that need to be trained. And so, I think the method that seems most promising that people are working through are sort of adversarial generative networks, where where essentially you basically train AIs against each other, trying to beat each other and figure out ways to compete against each other. And I would imagine that for something like battle management, that kind of thing would be very helpful, both because it's an inherently competitive environment, and because that's probably what you probably end up with is essentially some human programmed scenarios to start with, and then you have the sort of adversarial generative process where AIs they're competing against each other in like simulation after simulation after simulation. In theory, then you get to a point where they've been through almost anything that they could see on the battlefield. Whether that will work in reality, obviously, but that's a technique that I think is promising for that kind of application.
But any mistakes would cost a lot more.
Oh, absolutely. Which is why I think the notions that people have of some kind of like Skynet-like applications of these systems are way off, because of that risk because of those risk of accidents. I think you'll almost always have human supervision at least at some level of aggregation, and sort of and sign off on important decisions, because it would take a long time, I think, for people to trust an AI to sort of do that. And there's actually academic research that suggests essentially a problem of algorithm bias, where people essentially, like, you tell people like, oh, like this AI can pilot the plane better than you, and they're like, I don't believe that. It's like a tipping point thing. Like, I don't believe it. I don't believe it. I don't believe it. I totally believe it. And the problem then is there's some research. It's a very small sample sizes, but it's not clear that it would generalize. But some research that suggests then that, say, like airline pilots then trust automated systems too much. That it takes a long time for them to trust the systems, but once they trust them too much, even when like they can look at things and say like, oh, the plane's actually going down, not up. And so I think that, at least in theory, like we're aware of these things. And so my bet is that means that you will end up with some supervision of these systems to try to correct for some, these kinds of things, to whatever extent you can.
Yeah, hi Leo, first year in the conflict management here. Thank you for the talk. I was wondering whether you could elaborate a bit on your take on AI and crisis bargaining. And for instance, how do you negotiate a conflict that is driven by autonomous structures, and to what extent could AI not only be the problem here, but also be a solution or enable a solution?
Well, I think it gets back to your belief in deterrence in a way, and that so here would be the concern from a crisis stability perspective. The concern would be, think about the from a nuclear perspective, dangerous launch postures during the Cold War. Pre-delegation, launch on warning, those kind of things that we think about as it's good not to have to do that. Now imagine a world in which you're increasing the pace of battle, which means you could lose much faster. The risk, I think, from a crisis stability perspective is that it creates incentives for, why don't we say, your biggest, baddest weapons, whether nuclear or not, to have, to pre-delegate for launch on warning, and in some cases potentially even to preempt. Because if you think that they're going to attack and that you might lose so fast that you can't strike back, then that obviously creates first strike instability. And I think I'll spin this around and give you a positive note on this, which is that if you believe in some ways, if you've read like a Jim Fearon or something, or sort of like rationalist work on why wars happen, that rationalist work on why wars happen assumes that incomplete information is a really important reason why wars happen, because you basically have two countries that are facing off and they disagree about who's going to win basically if they fight. To the extent that AIs help you actually get a better picture of what would happen if you engaged in the use of force, that could, again, in theory, create help solve your incomplete information problem, which makes it easier to then complete a bargain, whatever that bargain happens to be, to end the conflict.
So, on the issue of human supervision, and it sort of has to do with what you just said, what do you think, if there's any, is the maximum ceiling that you can take a level of human supervision to? So it sounds sci-fi-ish, but when I saw AlphaGo, what that spoke to was the potential of AI to not just operate on the ground at an operational level, but also its capability to engage in decision making. So to what extent can AI replace, I guess, upper level decision making down the road?
I think it depends on what you mean by replace. I mean, if what you're saying is in 20 years would war planners be, or even national leaders thinking about a crisis, maybe be assisted by some sorts of algorithm-based simulations? Yeah, but I think assisted by is probably where you'd be most likely to see that. But it's interesting how different countries are thinking about this differently. So the U.S. has tended to think about AI as well as robotics in terms of human-machine teaming, with the idea being that the United States believes that it's the best soldiers in the world, it has the best trained, best human capital in the world, and so the job of AI is to enhance the ability of soldiers or national decision makers to make good decisions. Other countries don't necessarily see it that way. In particular, more autocratic countries that exist that don't trust their people to begin with. The AI is an opportunity to reduce your reliance on a population that's already not very trustworthy. And so I think this is a case where I think you could see national variation. I think in a country like the United States, you'd be much more likely to see AI almost always used once you get to a certain level of aggregation and decision, in a sort of assisting kind of way. Certainly, in like a time frame that one could reasonably kind of talk about. It's easier for me to imagine AI replacing people. The more autocratic you get and the smaller the sort of selectorate in a country is, the smaller the set of elites are who are really important for making decisions, because in that way a regime can minimize its vulnerabilities. It has incentives to minimize its vulnerabilities by not trusting its people and instead trusting an algorithm.
Can I say two finger on that?
Yeah.
So part
That was
of,
really scary, right?
yeah, well, no, part of this when I think about this and when you hear people talk about China's investment for purposes like that, you sort of sit back and say, well, are there environments that are more conducive to both producing this technology and adapting this technology, right? That's obviously a big bet. You could say, well, China, Russia, whoever is making these incredible investments and they might be able to develop these technologies, they, in your story, actually implement them more effectively. But over the long haul, then someone might have a question, well, is this really the right environment to generate these innovations over, which is a kind of a 35,000-foot question, but it's something that always lurks in the back of my head, that perhaps 5-10 years, this looks good, but over the long haul, being able to sustain this kind of innovation and implementation might prove a challenge for a less open system. And maybe I'm not thinking about that correctly.
No, I think that that's, I mean, I think that that's certainly the bet, that the, you know, think back to the Cold War and the, if you remember like Matt Evangelista's Innovation in the Arms Race, which talked about how the Soviets were actually really, once they figured out what they were going to do and the basic technology was perfected for it, they would actually be faster in some ways at reproducing it, developing it, implementing it than the United States. What they were less good at was figuring out new stuff and figuring out sort of new concepts. And one could imagine a similar situation. In some ways, I think that's the bet that that we're making. But if you look at, say, like an Eric Schmidt and his comments last November about China's AI strategy being a Sputnik moment for the United States, the implied there is the notion that like that assumption might not be right anymore, and that you could that a hybrid economy like China might actually be able to innovate. I mean, you can find, I think you can find reasonable people informed by data on both sides of this argument.
What would your bet be?
My bet would be that the Chinese will struggle at like really new sorts of things. But the problem is that this will tell us in some ways whether that matters or not. In that the more you're in this kind of world, the more the extent to which their AI strategy generates, you know, economic competition that they can do at least pretty well in, then there's a lot of opportunity for them. You know, there's a lot of opportunity for them there. I think it'd be, again, like who knows, but like I'll pound the podium and say I thus think it's unlikely that you get like that the Chinese would invent the AI equivalent of stealth in some, you know, or something like that. But again, that's based on in some ways like a very like Western economic, like an assumption that about the sort of free market and innovation, and like, and you look, I mean, people like Eric Schmidt think that assumption like might not be right anymore. Like, who am I to question? Although I guess I just did.
Yeah, I was going to ask how you think we should be thinking about the HR component of this. You had a really good anecdote with the sort of commander who never once had to have these sort of technical skills that now sort of on the battlefield is kind of required to understanding these basics of the algorithms. So it seems like it's going to cross a whole spectrum of space that never once had to have people that at least understood the basics of it. So how to think about that challenge?
So I think it's a great question. I'm actually I'm the research director for a working group on AI and national security at CNAS in town. Where like that's one of the kind of questions that we're starting to think about. I think what you could end up with is I think certainly some generational issues. In that, or I would say the intersection of generational issues and sort of technical competence. And that, like, just like there are some grandparents who like don't just have like their iPhone, but also have figured out how to use like Instagram or like even Snap. Even though like most people of a certain age like aren't necessarily that good at that. I think what you're more likely to see is essentially generational, you know, with exceptions, generational issues where you're going to need. I mean, it's an argument in some ways for educational systems, things like that, actually being what will be critical to future technology leadership. If you don't need to be a coder, but you need to understand how coding works.
So, probably the last, 15 years or so, you see the Department of Defense reaching more and more into the private sector in order to get some of their technological developments in the battlefield. And so I wonder if there's not a situation where you might have the Pentagon go to Alphabet and say, hey, can you help us develop an armed drone or some sort of weapon system that will be used on the battlefield to kill people? And then maybe Alphabet turns around and they say, well, if this gets out, it'll make Google look bad, and we can't do that. We can't take that risk because we are a socially conscious company, like a lot of tech companies in America are.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder how that would affect maybe if you go to China, where you have a state-owned enterprise that has a lot of money that goes into sort of research, and maybe they don't have the same sort of scruples. And I wonder if that's a disadvantage for us.
I think it's too soon to tell whether it'll be a disadvantage, but in some ways the case you just laid out is actually happening right now. So it was revealed a couple weeks ago that publicly that Google's actually been helping with Project Maven. And again, Project Maven is about image processing, and there's not, that's not the like the pointy end of the spear, but but still you had, I think a couple thousand people who work for Google have now signed a petition saying that, we don't want them to be, we don't want our company to be working on this because it contravenes our values. And so I think that would be an early indicator that this is something that some companies will be sort of concerned about. The question is sort of what happens to the marketplace. One possibility is that what does that create incentives for? It creates incentives for really good AI companies that don't have those qualms to sort of pop up. Although again, can they compete with Google for talent? Like Missy Cummings, who's at Duke, has argued that one of the things that's holding back military applications of AI is that the commercial market offers so much more in the way of sort of pay and benefits that there are not enough trained people yet. And so the commercial sector can actually drain some of the military sector's ability to work on this, which is probably why you go to Google in the first place. But another possibility is that, this is an early stage kind of issue, and people are still trying to figure out what's okay and what's not okay. And it could be that in some ways that a company like Google 20 years from now actually does plenty of defense business, and that's now a regular part of sort of what they do. I think you could potentially see it evolve either way, and it's a little early to tell. But I definitely think there's a going on right now example that would be, I think, validate in some ways that there's at least a risk of what you're outlining.
Well, first off, thank you for a really awesome talk. I learned a lot and it was fascinating. I am curious what you think about, I really like this two-pathway system that you've laid out, but I'm curious what you think about the role of the fact that military and civil, China is working on integrating their military and civil sectors right now very heavily, both in R&D and in production capacity and things like that. And also in the US, there's a long history of military and commercial cooperation on developing new technologies. So does that history have any impact on this typology, or do you think it's still sort of, you can clearly separate these new technologies to either dual use or exclusive?
I think that this is stylized, I think, to be sure. And I think when we look at technologies, when we look at technologies in the real world, almost any military technology, there are some, if you go far enough back in the chain of the capabilities, you're going to get to something commercial. Some parts of it are going to be commercial at some point. So I would start there by saying that I think in some cases are easier, obviously, I picked two examples that are relatively extreme to kind of illustrate it. Let me say a word about the US and then a word about China. In the US, we thought about the traditional technology development model as sort of military R&D leads to innovations that then spin off into the commercial sector. And now what we're seeing is in some ways the opposite, where this spin on, or none of the really alternative terms have caught on, but the commercial innovation essentially spinning into the military. So there is plenty of collaboration in that way, but it's also striking that if you look at who builds varieties of military equipment in the United States, it's 4 or 5 companies basically that do that. You've actually had pretty clear market segmentation between that didn't always exist. And so in some ways, one possibility then would be that a world in which AI turns out to be really important, you actually end up going back to more previous models where instead of having essentially your defense industry sector in your private sector, commercial sector, you end up with more sort of horizontal integration in similar companies. Like Google has a defense, a defense sector, as opposed to spinning off a separate company that then does all their defense work. In China, I think what they've announced with the AI strategy is fascinating. And it really is an attempt to deliberately exploit that commercial leadership and solve this potential issue of how do you get your sort of private sector companies to work on military developments. I mean, I think that the challenge for them, and this is why I think one of the reasons why they're investing so much money, is that, again, to the extent that the military problems you're trying to develop algorithms to solve aren't problems that make you money in the private sector, then you need to balance that out somehow, or else you just become a defense contractor, which again is fine, plenty of money in defense contracting. But I think that the Chinese are clearly attempting more of that sort of integration than certainly the U.S. is, because it's a more command economy, and they can sort of do that. And but it's a bet. And part of this gets back to the question that Frank asked about whether the extent to which you think you can get. You'll see sort of what we would think about as like outside the box kind of technology innovation, or invention would be the better invention, sort of out of that arrangement in a more command economy.
We hear a lot about AI safety from these days, specifically from countries who've been adopters of AI per se. So given AI's barrierless nature, like a crypto maybe, how do you really think it's going to be easy to regulate such safety funds, and how do you think its impact is going to be with respect to balance of power situation?
The safety issues surrounding AI? Sorry, what?
Sorry?
You mean, yeah, so you mean like how will safety concerns with AI?
Yeah, if you have a safety fund,
Right.
organized countries are envisaging.
Right. Oh, I understand what you mean.
Yeah.
I think that those kinds of safety organizations are going to be focused more on the regular economy, and so they're not probably going to be used for military purposes. I do think that concerns about safety are something that's likely to hold back the deploy. I mean, if you think about from like a military technology perspective, you have like basic R&D, you have capability development, you have deployment, you have use. I think what it means is if you, to the extent that this gets back to another question, I think issue that you raised, Frank, that I think this could do is hold back deployment. You end up with a bunch of development with concerns about safety, meaning that commanders are very careful about where and when they deploy various AI systems until they become more confident in them.
Well, Mike, I think I feel the same way everyone does, that I feel a lot smarter after this presentation. That was tremendous. My head's buzzing. I'm sure everybody else is. So thank you very much for a terrific presentation. Please join me in thanking